Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 3. It's hard to believe, but it's already day 3 of Listen Up, the Power of Podcasting, Bulgaria's first podcast festival. So far, we've met some amazing storytellers who took us along with them on a journey behind the scenes of some great podcasts like Radiolab and Rough Translation. We also talk about the rise of news podcasts, and today it's gonna be all about investigative journalism, because in increasingly investigative journalists choose audio to tell investigative stories. And we had some amazing speakers tonight that I'll introduce to you in just a second. But before that, some housekeeping tips. You can ask your questions to our speakers using the Q&A section in this webinar. So please feel free to ask away, and we'll have time to answer them at the end of the session. For those of you who are watching us on Facebook and YouTube, you can ask your questions in the comment section below. And for those of you who like to share some insights about the festival or the speakers on social media, please use the hashtags podcast festival and listen up. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, or maybe Friday afternoon, depending on the country that you are. And it's an incredible pleasure to introduce to you Maeve McClanagan. She is an award-winning journalist based in the UK. She is also working with the Center of Investigative Journalism, and she's done some amazing work investigating homelessness in the United Kingdom, as well as domestic violence. Last but not least, she's also the creator and host of the Tip-Off. If you haven't heard of the Tip-Off, you should definitely have a listen after we're done here, but you'll have a chance to hear about it as well later tonight. So hello, Maeve, and welcome.
So in this session, we're going to be hearing a lot about Daphne Caruana Galizia, an amazing investigative journalist from Malta. Daphne, as many of you probably already know, was doing groundbreaking work before her untimely death. She created a blog called Running Commentary, and she seemed to be fearless. She would call out businessmen, corruption, politicians, whoever it might be in Malta. And she rattled a lot of cages, and she pissed off a lot of people, as all good investigative journalists should. And Daphne paid the highest price for her incredible work. In October 2017, she was killed when a car bomb detonated under her car. So we're going to hear a little later on from her son, Paul, about how he created an amazing podcast called My Mother's Murder. But first, we're going to listen to Jules Giraud-Dat, who is the deputy editor of Forbidden Stories, to hear a little bit about how Daphne's work has continued on past her death, and how investigative journalists all around the world have decided they're not going to let her killers win. They're going to keep going and make sure that the things that she was digging into are exposed. So Jules, thank you for being here.
Hello, Maeve. Hello, Boriana, and hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation.
So maybe, Jules, could you start by telling us briefly, what is Forbidden Stories? What is it that you guys do?
Yes, Forbidden Stories, it's a consortium, a group of international investigative journalists. We are currently 45 journalists from 30 media outlets such as The Guardian, The Washington Post, Le Monde, or Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany. And the idea is when a journalist is killed, we try to start to investigate the death of this journalist and to continue his work, to try to expose it as broadly as possible. And the idea is to, most of the time when journalists are killed, they are very isolated. They don't necessarily belong to a major news organization. That was the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia. They have received threats for many months, many years. And so at the end, they are easy target. And the goal of the people that kill journalists is to silence them, to silence their source stories, and to make sure that citizens don't hear or don't read this very important issue of public interest. And our idea is to collaborate, retrieve the work of these journalists, work together, investigate as far as possible, ask questions to the people responsible, and to publish all together at the same time to get as much impact as possible.
So can you tell us how and why you came across Daphne's work particularly? What was the decision making there, and that would be one of the cases that you took on?
We actually, Forbidden Stories was launched in October 2017, the same month when Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed. Many journalists of our consortium were participating to the Panama Papers. Matthew Caruana Galizia, was a member of the ICIJ. I was working in the same office as him, for instance, for a few months in Paris. So, many journalists from the group knew Matthew, knew the work of Daphne, knew the publication she made and the impact it had in Malta. So, there was a spontaneous reaction saying, we have to do something, we have to react, we have to work together, we have to show that, we can't let this killing like that, and we have to continue. And it's how the project started in late October 2017, and until today, we are still all working together.
And so where do you start when you take up the work of Daphne? She had a lifetime of digging into things. She knew, as Paul describes in his podcast, Malta is quite a small, close-knit society. Everyone seems to know each other. She seemed to know, Maltese politics and business links intimately. So how do you, as journalists, taking that on from the outside, where do you start? And I guess we should say, there was this suggestion that Daphne was killed not necessarily for stories that she had done, because they had already come out. It's almost too late to, it wasn't necessarily an act of retribution. The suggestion was she was killed because of what she was getting towards, what she was about to publish. So where do you start when you try and take on the work of something like that?
First of all, we started to meet and talk with Paul, Matthew, and Andrew, the three sons of Daphne, because you have heard the podcast of Paul, and you're going to talk with him later. But there was perhaps the three person in Malta that, with their mother, that knew the best, what is going on, the corruption, the endemic corruption, they had everything in mind. And first of all, we needed, their approval for starting this project. Then to put in place some rules to, at the same time protect them, and at the same time not, jeopardize the investigation. But first of all, we spent, I remember, meetings in London or in Paris, and for hours, I was myself, I didn't know pretty much anything about Malta. In Paris, you have like posters that invite you to go for holidays in Malta in the metro, but that's it. So, it was very shocking and to hear, all these stories, all these leads, and at the same time, we got access to some documents she was working on, some elements, of her mobile phone or things like that. And, that was our base. And the first thing was to read her blog. There were thousands of articles and posts. Daphne was almost a newsroom by itself, by herself. Sorry, she was writing 2 or 3 posts a day and was investigating so many leads. So we had to evaluate the different leads, then to choose on which one we're going to focus. That will be the most, the most sensitive ones, and that could maybe, you know, maybe the motive of her assassination. And then we all met in Paris with all the 45 journalists, and we started to share the work and to split. And that's how we started, actually.
So you're almost doing two investigations. You're investigating,
yes.
you know, what it was she was looking into, but you're also trying to kind of put together the cryptic clues of, because as I understand it, Daphne's blog could be quite cryptic sometimes. She might allude to things without laying out exactly what it was she knew. So you're kind of trying to read between the lines and investigate her thought process as much as digging as well.
Yes, and I mean, there are two lines of investigation. You know, it's investigating her murder and trying to find the killers and the masterminds, and then you have to continue the work, because that's our goal. You know, it's they didn't win. You know, they killed the messenger, but not the message. You know, that's the dynamic. But then investigating her leads of investigation give us clues or who might have an interest in killing her, you know. So I think both work together. And yes, sorry, your second question was?
Yeah, well, just that you were trying to kind of read between the lines of her blog posts.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've never met Daphne, but you know, from what I've read and the people I talked to and that were close to her, and even, you know, citizens in Malta, because everyone knows her in Malta. You know, everyone called her Daphne. You say Daphne in the street, everyone knows who you're talking about. And I think it was the case before she was killed. I mean, you know, she could be tough on people, and she can call people crook if she wants to. But she was, you know, that was her way to work. And at the same time, she was an amazing investigator, you know, and you know, she maybe made some mistakes, but as every journalist, but most of her work, she was true on everything. And when we see that at the end, you know, the government collapsed, she was true on everything. And that's quite amazing. You know, when you're alone, when you're in a major newspaper, you know, you have fact checkers, you have lawyers, you have colleagues, you have editor-in-chief, you know, you have many ways to fact check your investigation. She was alone at the end. So I think one of the first things we did was trying to meet her sources, because it's, you know, the people who were taking the risk with Daphne and that had information to reveal. The problem is when we arrived in Malta, you know, in a few weeks after she was killed, people were scared because the message that was sent by killing her with, you know, killing her in a car bomb, you know, it's really a message that is sent. People were really afraid, and people would say, okay, am I the next one? They were not confident in the independence of the police, so they were wondering, you know, if they will get access to, I don't know, her messages, her notes, and will come to them. So that was the trickiest point at the beginning.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, how do you go about when you don't have contacts? You know, you don't have the phone numbers in your phone of all of the people that she did, but because you had access to some of her documents and things, you could follow those trails. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we realized quickly, and, you know, thanks to Paul, Matthew, and Andrew, you know, they you know, helped us a lot, giving us contacts. You know, like, for instance, Matthew was working a lot with her mother. You know, they were collaborating. So we had some ideas of, you know, who is who. We got some contacts, and then the idea is, that's why it's great to be a group. Is you know, 2 people will go, I don't know, on October, and then 2 people will go on December, and then 2 other people. And so the idea was to be constantly present on the field, and so that people know that we are always here, that they can meet us, that they can be in confidence. You know, you can't create a connection with someone in 2 hours. You have to come back and show. And I think it's how that worked, and how perhaps we managed to reveal some information at the end.
Was the language barrier an issue in that? Were journalists talking English, or, you know, how did you?
I mean, luckily in the group, people have a better English than mine, so that was fine. No, I mean, most of the people in Malta speak English. Then part of the population only speak Maltese, but luckily we were working with Jacob Borg, with a Maltese journalist from the Time of Malta. So when it was too complicated with the language, he was coming with us. That's why it's interesting to collaborate.
And so before the ICIJ really forged this path with collaboration on such a scale, investigative journalism was often seen as quite a solitary pursuit and almost a competitive pursuit. You didn't want to tell anyone about what you were doing. You didn't want to get scooped by anyone. You certainly weren't going to go and talk to a fellow competitor about what it was you were working on. Tell us about how you coordinated a group of journalists on this, and how you one do that practically. I presume it isn't people just emailing each other with sensitive information, but also how you get buy-in and trust from everyone that they're all working for the same goal.
I think you have the answer in your question. Is really it's thanks really to the work of the ICIJ that I think why Forbidden Stories managed to work so well. Laurent Richard had this amazing idea to create Forbidden Stories, but then of course there were major collaborative projects before the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and I think it's thanks to that we started to work with, we created our group of journalists, but many of them had already worked together on previous projects. So the trust was already there. Then new people arrived and came, but, the start of it was good. And, one of the director of Forbidden Stories is Bastian Obermeier, who is one of the two journalists that, broke the Panama Papers. And so, it's Bastian and others are journalists that know how to collaborate, like Juliette Garside from the Guardian. They know how to collaborate. So I think that was quite easy. And the second thing is, when a journalist is killed and you continue her work or his work, I think it's in a sense chilling everyone down, kind of. You're here for a very important cause, so you will not start to, I don't know, hide information to your colleague, or really the goal is to go as far as possible. And as well, we think that it's collaborating protects the people on the field and protect us as well, because it doesn't make sense to kill one journalist if there are 44 that know everything that he knew and will continue the work. So and yes, I think that collaboration is perhaps the best answer today, is when we know in the area of fake news and how journalism and journalists are pointed by politicians and all that. I think the best answer is to say, look, we are not competitors, we're collaborating for the good cause, to bring the best information to the public.
And presumably it mitigates the legal risk as well. If one jurisdiction is particularly likely to sue, does it help in that way?
Of course, when you start to investigate, on the government of a country or on private companies, foreign governments, private banks, of course you have legal issues. They have the best lawyers, they have the money, they have the power. So if you collaborate, you can fact check the information together. So of course you're more powerful. Then there is the trust is very central in our project, because let's say there is a journalist of Le Monde that is doing an interview with a source. The journalist of The Guardian will not meet the source necessarily for security issues. So you need to trust really, your partner. So that's very important. And then the idea as well is that when journalists got killed, it's true in the case of Daphne, but in many other countries where we went to these past years, most of the time they are in front of very powerful people, prime ministers, director of multinationals. And so, the balance of power, it's not fair at all. And the idea is to inverse that a bit. And when, of course, we send an interview request on behalf of 30 media outlets, the company say, I might need to answer at that time. It's easier than, just one newspaper.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you put the fear of God in everyone that gets that email. You mentioned earlier as well that, you know, there's an ongoing legal process in trying to prosecute the alleged killers of Daphne, and that you had to be sensitive to that in your work. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigate that so that you don't compromise any kind of legal justice there?
I mean, I think our goal is to, you know, there is a legal procedure that is going on. Our role is to question it sometime. Is it, you know, is it the justice working independently? Is the police independent? Is there any interference with, you know, the executive? So that's our work. And then I think the best way to push the authorities to do their job is to investigate ourselves and you know, to publish evidence, proofs, and that, you know, put the pressure on the justice system to react. You know, if there is any problem, if an independence is the best way. So then, of course, our goal is not to jeopardize the legal procedure, and you know, it's two different things. But our goal is to just to put the pressure and to be sure that this legal procedure is working independently.
And the network has uncovered some remarkable things, some of which Paul documents in the podcast. But for people who haven't yet had a chance to listen, maybe you could summarize a little bit about what it is that you found out doing this work.
I mean, I think there are two important things. You know, the first one is when Daphne was killed, before she was killed, she was working on many topics, but two very important ones. The first one, you know, she knew that there was an offshore company in Dubai called 17 Black. And, you know, she had the intuition that this company was created to, you know, send kickbacks to politicians. And, you know, she started to have information on that. And second thing is just, you know, in the weeks before she was killed, she received a massive leak from a public company called Ena Malta, which is, you know, an energy company in Malta, involved on the main public contract of the past years for the creation of an energy plant in Malta. And, you know, it was right before she was killed. And then what we realized after, and what we discovered after, which is the right word, is that the owner of this company, 17 Black, was Jürgen Fenech, who is the person today prosecuted for the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, that is suspected to be the mastermind, or at least one of the mastermind of her killing. That this company was supposed to send kickbacks to two other offshore companies belonging to the chief of staff of the previous prime minister and the energy minister of the previous government. So, you know, she had everything right, and that's perhaps one of the motives of her assassination. And these kickbacks were supposed to be made on the public contract of Ena Malta and the creation of this energy plant. So, you know, everything makes sense. And there is perhaps here a motive for a murder. And I think it would be the most terrible motive in a sense, because it's implicating, you know, people at the top level of the government. Jürgen Fenech is one of the most important businessman in Malta. There is Azeri money implicated in this deal as well, and we know that, you know, Azerbaijan is not necessarily a democracy. So I think there is, you know, geopolitical issue. There is corruption at top level of the government. She was pointing very sensitive issue, and that's perhaps the reason why she was killed.
Thank you so much for that, Jules. Forbidden Stories do incredible work. I would really recommend everybody go and find the website, read the articles from the Daphne Project, and indeed many other journalists who you're supporting and many other investigations that you're continuing with. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through that. I think we have
Thank you.
Paul now who has...
And hello, Paul.
Thank you so much for joining us.
No, my pleasure. Sorry, it's
We've been
a
hearing
bit
from Jules about the amazing work of Forbidden Stories, taking up your mother's incredible investigations and proceeding with them. And we'd love to hear a bit from you about, I guess, specifically about the podcast, seeing as this is a podcasting festival. Maybe you could tell us when it was that you came up with the idea of turning this journey into a podcast, and why choose that as a medium rather than film or book or a long form article?
a good question. I suppose I'm a bit of a strange guest for a podcast festival, because this was my first podcast, first and only podcast, and the decision to do this as a podcast was made for me. So maybe what I'm about to say is more directed at people who haven't done podcasts or feel like it's not for them, because that's actually what I thought. I thought I'd rather just write, which is what I'm used to. The decision was made, I think, around October. So before that really intense period Jules was just talking about. And I just didn't know where to start, So one of my editors at Tortoise said, look, we really want to do this as a podcast. I'm going to pair you up with an audio producer. So for people who are interested in doing something like that, that's the first thing I'd recommend is working very early on with an audio producer, because they think about things that a non-audio reporter wouldn't normally think about. I think the kind of audio you need to pick up, the way you interview people, where you go, that sort of thing. And the planning kind of started in London, and we were interviewing people there at first, because so many of the people involved in our campaign are based in London, so the NGOs, the lawyers. And then we made plans to go to Malta. And the really extraordinary thing is we picked actually a quiet week so that people would be available for interviews. And the date was, so the plan was to arrive on the 19th of November. And so we'd kind of fill the week with interviews. There was a little court on, nothing, no news we expected. So Gary, my audio producer, and I arrived that night, and then within a few hours, and again, so all these kind of pictures started coming into my phone of Jorgen Fenech's super yacht being raided out at sea, his yacht being brought back into his family's private marina, and it just really took from there. The podcast then took this shape of that day. So we started kind of in reverse. We started with the arrest of this man, and then kind of unwound the story of how we got to him.
Fantastically fortunate, I guess, that you happened to be there at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, it was unbelievable, and really not something I'm used to, being in the right place at the right time. But sometimes it happens. And then it was this very spacey, live feel.
Yeah, fantastic for the kind of narrative arc, if you will, of the podcast that you had. This.
Right. Yeah.
I was going to ask, how do you find and create scenes? Because that's a classic documentary making technique, right? You show, you don't tell, and that can be hard to plan for. But
yes,
it's a bit of luck.
Yeah, no. And you're right. And the kind of, there are podcasts, there are good podcasts where, you have a kind of host guest type discussion setting, a series of interviews. And I thought initially that's what we'd end up with, interspersed with us walking around Malta talking about the scene. Because that's the nice thing about audio, you can walk somewhere and talk about what you're looking at. And expressing a scene in audio is so much more efficient than doing it in words. So the kind of best example from the podcast Gary and I did, I think, are the protests in the last episode. So in this week, Malta just completely erupted. Protests day and night, multiple times a day, outside Parliament, the Prime Minister's office. And we were there, you know, we were in the crowd, picking up the sound of people shouting, talking to protesters, actually participating in the protest. And I thought, how extraordinary. If I had to write this down, you know, how would I even do it? I'd have to kind of pull out a notepad in the middle of the protest, take down notes, you know, like a nut, and then go home and write it up. Whereas now we're just walking around with a microphone. And when you hear it in the last episode, I think it's just really moving, I think, hearing that live, you know, that protest.
Yeah, I think that some of the beauty of podcasting can be how immersive it can feel as a listener, but also that sense of intimacy. And I think because we feel like we know you so well by that point, I think it's the final episode. There's even that moment where you talk about how you were so angry during a protest that your producer's trying to get you to talk and you just can't even vocalize it.
Yeah.
Even as a really powerful.
He was super annoying, but very professional. Because you know, it's strange. If you read a story, let alone you're part of it, you're used to being alone. You know, you arrange your own appointments.
Yeah, no, and fantastic to get all of those scenes on tape. But I guess going even back a step, you know, when you started out on this process, it's in some ways a very complicated story, or there's a lot of detail, and you as someone so close to the story, and obviously, you know, so close to your mother and having a personal involvement in it, how do you sift through all those details and find the critical distance to know, you know, this is the thing we need to put in it, and this stuff is kind of extra information that wouldn't work in the podcast or isn't necessary to the core story?
Look, it's really difficult, you know, because reporting on any story like this would be hard. If you're talking about someone so close to you, then it's exhausting. And the difficulty for people who are used to doing written journalism, the difficulty with a audio project is that the editing process means you're in and out of a studio. You're saying the same thing in different ways, or something slightly different in the same way over and over again, and that can be really punishing if you have some emotional connection to the story. So it's unlike, say, sharing a Google Doc with your editor, make some comments, and then you send it back, which is there's some more distance. On the rest of, but there's no way. You just need a good editor, you need a good producer, you need them to respect that these things can be tiring. And for the rest of it, you go through that usual editorial process, you know, of accumulating some base of facts. A reporter tends to think everything they've uncovered or collected is important and interesting. So then an editor has to come along and tell you, actually no, we only need this much. But what I liked about working on a multi-part podcast is you have to be really disciplined in even how you write. So the parts you script in, so your sentences need to be short, your words very clear, the arc needs to be clear. You can't be lazy, I think, in a way that maybe in written journalism you can fall into being.
Yeah, and you do a great job. I think there's even, I think it might be the second episode where you kind of say, wait, stop, that was all a bit complicated, you know, talking about shell companies and how they're connected, and you kind of go back and explain it again. And as a listener, I found out really helpful because, you know, as intimate as a podcast is, you might be listening to it while you're doing something else. And it's quite nice to have someone say, let's talk it through one more time.
Yes, no, thanks. And I think, yes, I mean, what we were able to do was really nice is get people to talk about the work they've done. So Juliette Garside and Stephen Gray, both members of the Daphne project, which Jules was talking about. So that I really enjoy, because you have people who did the work, you know, they were witnesses to it, talking about it in their words, how they got the story, what they thought of it. And that's quite a nice thing to do if you're able to do it.
Tell me about the decision to interview family members, specifically your brothers, as part of that, and what that was like, because I can't imagine trying to interview family members, never mind about something as traumatic as this.
Yeah. So the interview with Matthew was the one I was looking forward to least, for obvious reasons. But then, how can you not? You know, he was the first one at the scene, was alone there for a while, and has been at the center of most of the campaigning to date. And I think with my brothers, for the past 3 years, the situation has been that we sort of did everything together anyway. So it felt unnatural to me, in a kind of personal way, not to speak to them for this podcast. It wouldn't have reflected reality, first of all, because again, we did all the work together. And it's just something I wanted to do. On the other part, so I interviewed my Aunt Cora, so my mother's sister, and my maternal grandparents as well. And that was to cover the sort of biographical part of it. So rather than have me drone on about my mother's childhood and adolescence and whatever else, the idea was to get them to do it. And after all, they're better witnesses, because my aunt grew up with her, my grandparents raised her, so they are closer in a way to the facts. I guess it could have worked differently. I could have done it as a kind of memoir and say, I remember my mother like this, but I don't know. It's just a question on what the nature of it is. And it was already difficult territory because I'm kind of reporting on my family. So this was, I guess, speaking to them, also a way of making clear this isn't all me talking from memory and experience.
Yeah, and I think it's really nice as a listener to have different voices as well. It helps kind of move the story on in a way. And it was really lovely to have so much of your mother, Daphne's voice in there as well, using these audio, some of it public and some of it kind of private interviews that she had done. How did you come to that decision, and what was that like to find and include that?
Yeah, so that seemed, you know, you can't. It was for obvious reasons we couldn't speak to the protagonist, so we started looking for interviews she gave, which was hard because she actually didn't give very many. She never liked kind of being the story herself, although that's really what ended up happening. And so we looked through a lot of archival material for interviews. Amazingly, we found that really old interview she gave, I don't know, mid-90s, I think, something like that, which was just amazing to hear her talk about when she started writing, what it was like. So that was a real kind of precious, at least for me, precious find. Another extraordinary thing was about 10 days before she was killed, a researcher from the Council of Europe had interviewed her not for publication, just for her own research project. So it was an on-background interview. And she talked at length about the pressures she felt as a journalist, the difficulties she got started. So it was this incredible witness statement of her whole career. And my God, 10 days before she was killed. And had she not given that interview, there would have been so much we'd have never known about her. So we drew on that quite a lot. So that was really good.
Powerful to hear her voice.
Yeah, no.
A tricky question, but did you ever consider trying to interview any of the accused or any of the kind of higher politicians that are mentioned in it? That might be, if it wasn't your story as a journalist, you might say, well, I need to go and get their take on it.
Yeah, no, of course we did, and none of them wanted to. Yeah, they just weren't very interested, which is unfortunate, but then also understandable in a way from where they're standing. And things they may have agreed to it before Fenech was arrested, but like Jules was saying, that was a real turning point. Not just in my mother's case, but in Maltese history, because so much has changed since then, and so much will continue to change. But once we passed that point, they were gone. Muscat, Schembri, they had nothing. They stopped caring, in short, about how the public saw them. That ship sailed. The fight became something else altogether for them. It became purely criminal. It wasn't a PR battle anymore.
Right, and as Jules explained, and as we heard before, it's an ongoing issue. Maybe before we go to, I mean, I could talk to you for days, but before we go to some other people's questions, my final question is, how do you know when to stop? How did you know this was going to be a 4-part series and then we put a full stop? Or are there going to be further episodes? Because there's continuations in the case, it seems, every day.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I made as a point you in saying that the decision for 4 episodes was totally arbitrary and not mine. And it could have been longer, maybe. I really feel it's a complete work now. It's a kind of, it's really how I felt, saw things at the time. And I hope it kind of gives a basis, provides a basis for other people to work on it. I think the story isn't, as Drew said, fading away. It's doing the almost opposite. Sorry, a car alarm has just gone off.
That's tape. It takes
yeah, this is what you want. Now my baby's crying in the background, so it's a crisis. So I think it's an amazing story, and I hope people keep working on it, because it's becoming increasingly dramatic, and we are nowhere near a resolution. So Fenech was arrested that week, but you know what? A jury trial is maybe 2 years away. And you could do a whole podcast about that single jury trial, right? So
did I read that you're writing with your brothers?
That's right. Unfortunately, not so much with my brothers, more alone, which is what happens when you're the youngest. But yes, so I spent the most of the past year working on a book, which has been a difficult thing to do for the same reasons that the podcast was difficult, because it's, you end up in this bizarre situation where you're reporting on your mother speaking to her school friends, speaking to her employers, her old editors, that kind of thing. But very good, you know, very. I found it very moving, and the book will be out, I think, in October.
Oh wow! Okay, so soon. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, incredible, incredible work, and the emotional.
That's very kind. Thank you.
No, it's amazing, and it's an amazing podcast. But I think, you know, we don't talk enough about the emotional toll generally of investigative journalism. Never mind when you have the kind of personal trauma that you've been facing as well. So to find a way through that is incredibly admirable. We have a few questions. If anybody has any more questions, drop them now in the Q&A. First one was, somebody has asked, Mike has asked, seeing as this was your first podcast, what was the one biggest thing you learnt about the podcast making process?
If I, leaving aside the subject matter, and say you're someone like me who had no experience with your projects, that's really from there. It would be the main kind of foundational point. How do you producer with you?
So have somebody with a bit of critical distance and a second pair of ears, I guess, to help you sift through the details and find the storytelling.
Point is the main one, because they know what they're doing. They know the kind of sounds, field sounds, whatever you call them, you need to pick up. They know when an interview is sounding good. They know what to ask you to narrate parts of the podcast. So that is essential, I'd say.
We also have a question from Ivan, who asks, what do you think of the concept for embedded extreme journalism? Maybe Ivan can explain a bit further what it was he understands by that term. I know there's embedded journalists that work with kind of military occupiers and military organizations and things. But yeah.
I'm afraid I'm not sure what that means.
Yes, me neither. Ivan, if you can elaborate in the Q&A section, we can come back to that. But while we do, Paul, maybe you could talk a little bit about any safety protocol you had to put together when making the podcast.
Good question. So we agreed on with our editor on places where we couldn't go because they were too dangerous. So one place, for example, that would have been good to go to is where the 3 hitmen who've been charged with executing my mother sort of met and would discuss their plans in a very kind of deprived harbour town. So places like that were kept off limits for obvious reasons, but also because in my case, and because Malta is a small place, and because the campaigning has put me in the news, I'd be recognizable, and so nothing really good would have come of going to somewhere like that. To be honest, because we thought we were going to Malta to just kind of meet people in offices or living rooms or whatever, we didn't, and we just kind of found ourselves thrown into these protests every day. But that's no model to follow.
Yeah, that's a hard one to plan for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Paul. We appreciate that you're incredibly busy and that this is a kind of ongoing process that you're living, and it can be something that potentially tricky to talk about. So we really appreciate your time today.
No, it's been my pleasure. Sorry, the internet connection hasn't been great.
That is live. But if people want to hear more of your dulcet tones, they can listen again, if they haven't yet, to My Mother's Murder, which is really, yeah, a fantastic testament to your work and to your mother's work.
That's very kind. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for listening. If anyone wants to ask a question by email, say, my email address is on my Twitter profile, so it's paul@tortoisemedia.com. With the proviso that I'm really not an expert in podcasts. I did this one. I learned a lot doing it, and I think they're great. I think they offer reporters a real lot of room in how they tell a story, and can give it real color without kind of burning up hundreds or thousands of words. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It was great to have you with us, and special thanks to you as well. And of course, thank you, May, for moderating this discussion. Unfortunately, the gods of the good internet weren't with us today, but you know, that's the reality of having a virtual festival. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But please stay tuned, don't go anywhere, because we'll have just a brief 10-minute break, and then we'll be back with Maeve. And this time she will tell us the story of her own podcast. And trust me, she has a lot of interesting things to say. As Paul was saying, it's an interesting format to go behind the scenes and tell big investigative stories. And we're looking forward to the next session about the tip-off. So take a break, stretch your legs, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you.